the questions I want to ask, I mean, in a sense, like, of course, in a meeting like this, there is a lot of attention to what a macroeconomist would call the supply side. So what are the structural deficiencies, the the organizational limits that prevent growth in potential output in a country like Italy. The questions that I want to ask in this little interview are going to be more like asking questions to Bini Smaghi as a former central banker, basically, and asking questions about there is obviously has been a big lack of demand in Italy. So supply side is of course very important and it's crucial in the long run, but in the short run, we have experienced essentially 9 years of stagnating spending. So my first question is, among all kind of interventions that you can think of, what would be in your mind the most effective ways of stimulating private spending in Italy?
Well, thank you for the invitation and for these questions. In fact, in Italy, if I think about the last, well, interestingly, this morning, Luigi mentioned that everything changed in '95. If you look at the demand side for Italy, in fact, maybe things have changed earlier, because the '80s, when Italy performed relatively well compared to the rest of Europe, I mean, we forget that debt doubled. So there was a very expansionary fiscal policy during the '80s, and during the '70s, a very expansionary monetary policy. So I don't know, I tend to think that things changed in Italy in terms of underlying fundamentals after the first oil shock, and the way in which, and maybe the Scala Mobile and the whole laws, the labor laws that were implemented in the early '70s, that were, I think, hidden by the very expansionary monetary policy and then the very expansionary fiscal policy when Italy got into the EMS. And the real change, the end of all these expansionary policies were in the closing the gap to get into the euro, where basically demand side policies were stopped. And we realized then that we were maybe naked in the sense that we had to grow with the real side, and the real side was not that dynamic. But in fact, if I look at the beginning of the euro, we started with a primary surplus of, I think, 4.5%. And after a few years, we went to zero. So in fact, if we compare Italy to other countries, we had a relatively expansionary fiscal policy at the beginning. So we burned part of the bonus of entering to the euro and having low interest rates. And after that, fiscal policy became pro-cyclical, because after the crisis, of course, we ended up back to 120% of debt to GDP. Then we needed a government who tightened the fiscal policy. And after that, we are now in a relatively better shape. Growth is starting to come back, and we are thinking about expanding fiscal policy again. So I think the room for the demand side in Italy has been exploited already, unfortunately, too much, and we have very little on the fiscal side, at least. Monetary policy is decided by the ECB, and there again, over the last 2 or 3 years, the quantitative easing and everything has cut the interest burden by about 1 percentage point, and we have basically spent it all in increased spending. So we are not benefiting fully from monetary policy, the expansion of monetary policy, in terms of using this to reduce the debt. So the difficulty, I think, of Italy is that we are with 132 point something, and it's not coming down. And so when the next crisis will come, there is a risk of an additional jump in the debt. And this is why the spread is so sensitive in Italy.
Okay, so let me put the question a little differently. Okay,
Because I didn't answer. So.
No. You did. I think, I mean, the focus on the overall fiscal stance, I think it's true. Italy doesn't have the fiscal space to do a deficit, to increase deficits. The question is like, among the different structural reforms or compositional policies that you can do in changing the composition of spending and taxes, what are, in your views, those that would be more stimulating for private spending? So leaving aside public spending and the deficit, of course, there is no room for that, and it would be wrong to imagine that there is room for that. It would be dangerous. So the question is like, when we're thinking about structural reforms, when we're thinking about different ways of cutting taxes, different way of doing tax reforms, different ways of changing pensions and so on, I suspect we should think carefully about what are the effects on spending, and what is a smart way to go about it.
I would say, we are on streaming, so I should be a bit careful, but I would say it should be the opposite of what the government is doing, because the government is giving money to pensioners and not supporting young people and women whose average unemployment is around 40%. For a series of reasons, maybe because due to political instability, the government today is investing a lot on. I mean, is trying to anticipate the age of retirement. Is doing a series of measures like raising wages for the public sector, for teachers, and so on, and is not really thinking about part of society which does not have access to the labor market. And I mean, these people cannot spend. So in the end, you have the pensioners who are also grandfather or father and have to give money, and this is very inefficient and certainly does not help to support growth, because uncertainty about your labor market is not. In the end, it is a structural reform which supports also growth in that respect. So it's both supply and demand side.
Very good. So let me understand better. So it's something you already said now, and I wanted to just understand better, because it's something I've also seen in recent writings of yours. So there is this general view, which has also been put forward by Larry Summers, that we are living in a world of secular stagnation, which is essentially a world in which there is too much saving chasing too little investment projects. And in some writing, you say that there is something about the way in which pension reforms is being done now in Italy, which is actually gonna exacerbate the problem. So, I want to understand better what's your line of reasoning there. It sounds like
well, I mean, it's an argument you could use with Germans also, because this excess of saving is largely a German problem in Europe. So let me also speak about Germany, not only about Italy. And the typical line of argument in Germany, they complain about the ECB that is implementing QE and low interest rates. But the low interest rates are due to this excess of saving over investment, which in Europe is 3% of GDP. So it's about 300 and something billions. And Germany has 8% of GDP of surplus. Now, why are Germans saving so much? And the German answer is demographics, aging society. But that's the wrong answer. I mean, you should not save more. I mean, the problem when you have an aging society is that simply you have to work more. And they have done a fiscal reform, which is a pension reform, which is goes in the opposite direction, which was to reduce or to anticipate retirement instead of delaying it, a bit in the similar way as what Italy is doing, and this is of course very bad, because the longer is your lifetime after retirement, with no income you have to save if you're and so this is a perverse situation. I think it's the wrong policy answer, and that's what the European Commission or all the European partners should tell Germany to do, is to adapt like we did in Italy. Actually, we have a relatively good pension reform. We had a relatively good pension system that is indexing the retirement age to the life expectancy. The only thing which doesn't work in the Italian pension reform is that it is based on an assumption of a growth rate of employment of about, I think, 1% per year, and this is not in the facts. So we are now, I think, pension spending in Italy is 16% of GDP, is the highest ever. So we say that it's stable because indeed it doesn't increase, but it increases de facto by the fact that some of the assumptions are not realized.
Very good.
I feel like I'm under examination
No,
by the
don't
professor.
know. I never. Yeah, sorry. It shows that I'm not a journalist. I've never done an interview, so I have a list of questions and I go by them. But
I'm waiting when you say
I'm
very
not,
bad. I give you a
I'm
C.
really listening. My problem is that I'm not thinking about the next. I think a good journalist thinks about the next question. I'm actually trying to understand what he's saying.
Thank you.
Very good. I had. Why don't I jump? I had some question at the end, but maybe I'll jump there. You mentioned something about Germany and the problem of like excess savings in Germany and in general. So there are now a few books, a few articles that try to understand what is that goes so wrong in Europe when there is decisions to be made about how to tackle a crisis, why we find this kind of clashing cultures and views that are very much at odds, and then that delays the whole decisional process and makes a crisis worse. And there is, I don't know, Luigi Guiso and co-authors that have put forward some theory of why Germans and Greeks don't understand each other. There is a recent paper, a recent book actually by Marcus Brunner-Meyer and Harold James, who's trying to go back to before the war and what are the cultural roots of why Europeans seems to always be talking about different language when somebody's thinking about lending of last resort, Germans are thinking about moral hazard. When somebody's thinking about expansionary policy, Germans are thinking about debt. I mean, it's like there seems to be different languages, and you've been at the center of the storm. You've been at the ECB in the hot years of the crisis. What's your take on that?
Well, first, I think that it's true that seen from the US, it's not always easy to understand how Europe works, and it's even more difficult if you're not European. But I always try to tell American friends, well, look more closely to the way the US reacted. And it's true that in reality, the difference is that during the crisis, the US had some institutions and Europe did not, and had to build some institutions during the crisis. And it's also true that you tend to build institutions during crisis, or you change fundamentally during crisis. I think in the nature of facts, I think if you go to the history of the US, you see this constantly. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, after several crises. The welfare system of the US was created after the Great Depression and after the war. So it applies to the US also, the fact that you go through crisis. Now, the point is that you always have to ask your question, will we get out from the crisis? Will we be still alive after the crisis? Will Europe not collapse? And so, and this is, is a fundamental question when you come from a different history than the US, but the process is the same. And it's true that we are now confronted in Europe with a country which wants to leave. So, the reversal of the process can happen. And it's true that crises are important because they may help you to go forward, but they may also help you to go backwards. To some extent, this is true of the US. We don't need to talk about the election. They want to go back from NAFTA, and So Europe is not that different. And the cultural differences, if you think about monetary policy, there are fights I think there are even bigger fights in the US than in Europe about the Fed, about the independence of the Fed. and the core and the periphery, they have different meanings in Europe than in the US, but it exists also. If you look at the electoral map, you see the center and the periphery, like you see it in Europe. So I think these are fundamental differences that in fact have many things in common. If I think about the discussions about bail-in, for instance, well, in the US, TARP would not be possible anymore. I think there is a very good, those who are interested in banking and in history, Tim Geithner has given a speech at the annual meetings, the Pierre Johansson speech, where he says, what I did as Secretary of the Treasury and as I could not do anymore. I would have to go back to the Congress, and it would be basically impossible. So, this whole institutional changes that have come after the crisis, limiting also the powers of the state, have happened also in the US. The problem is that institutionally, Europe is not complete. We need to do a lot of things. And of course, if you have to wait for a crisis in order to do the next thing, it's very painful. Indeed, if you look at economic performance of Europe compared to the US, until 2011, Europe and the US, the euro area, and the US had more or less the same performance. If you take per capita, so if you take out population growth, GDP per capita were exactly the same. You do the plot, and they went up. Actually, Europe did even a bit better until 2007. Europe as a whole, and then you had different performance. It went down in 2009. It went back up in 2010, 11, and then after 11 there is a clear divergence. So something happened in 2011, 2012 that created a change in regime in Europe, and not only in Southern Europe, but also in Northern Europe. And this is the crisis, the European crisis, which still has lasting effects on confidence, and unfortunately, it means that people don't know whether Europe will still be here, the euro will still be here in 3 or 4 or 10 years. Most in conferences where I go, especially in the US, about Europe, people say, who believes, and there is a poll at the end, who believes that the euro will be here in 10 years? And okay, it depends on the answer, but this is an element of uncertainty. And if you think about creating a banking union, a capital market union, if you have in the back of your mind the idea that one country may leave, then of course you invest much less. And I think this is one of the problems in front of Europe. We have to complete this institutional framework to restore trust, to restore growth, to make sure that a bank in the north can invest in a bank in the south, an entrepreneur in the south can invest in the north without an exchange rate risk, without a political risk, which remains very, very strong in Europe.
So actually, that goes right into another question I had. It was like, where are we now on the banking union? What would happen now if there was like a major bank in trouble in Europe in terms of the
Well, paradoxically, it would be easier if a big bank was in trouble than many small banks, as Roberto knows, because it's the fund, the resolution fund, has been created, and the whole European supervision is targeted to the big banks. Small banks are still the responsibility of national supervisors to some extent. And as we discussed this morning, it's not easy to understand how to get out from some of these situations, and what would happen if the state comes in. We don't have the history, as in the US, of liquidating banks. The contagion effect might be very different. And it's never the right time to test the contagion. So I think this is an element of uncertainty, I would say. But we have made a lot of progress because we have a single supervisor. We have same rules across the board. We have a fund which deals with major events. We don't have, that's what's missing, we don't have a common deposit insurance scheme. I think that's the next step. We cannot discuss this before the German elections. There is a broad agreement except Germany. I think they know that they will have to give up. We need to find an agreement, and I think Italy is part of this agreement because the dependence of Italian banks on government bonds is still too large, in my view. So we have to find a way of mixing risk sharing and risk reduction in a way that leads us to a adequate compromise. We have proposals on the table. I think after the German election, this issue will come back, and I hopefully we don't need the next crisis to find a solution.
So, still talking about like bad scenarios. So, suppose now we have Trumponomics, big deficit in the U.S. Big deficit, which is actually very oriented toward domestic production, very non-tradable oriented. So not very good spillovers on the real side, but interest rates that go up, like in the U.S. How will the ECB respond? How Italy public debt problem survives?
Well, I think the analogy is probably to go back to the early 80s. So Reagan, the Reagan fiscal expansion. The only difference is that Yellen is not Volcker. So probably she will maintain low interest rates. She would, and they will not want to hurt manufacturing. So they will avoid an exchange rate appreciation of the dollar as it happened in the 80s. So we will have more inflation in the US before a tightening happens. But some dollar appreciation, I think, will be there. And that will help ECB because a weaker euro is an exchange rate, it's kind of a monetary policy accommodation. And it will maybe make life easier for the ECB, which now is under pressure to do more and more.
So that's assuming that the ECB keeps its eyes on core inflation and not on imported inflation.
Yes, but I think that if you continue to have this slack in the economy before inflation picks up and goes above 2%, it will take a lot of time. I think right now in Europe.
Overall Europe.
Overall Europe,
in
yes.
single countries.
So, and if you have a depreciation of the exchange rate, certainly inflation will start to go up maybe more in Germany because they're closer to full employment rather than Italy or Spain. So there is room for readjustment. So from the point of view of monetary policy, I would be happy if I was in Frankfurt. Now, of course, long-term rates will go up in the US, and some impact on Europe will be there. And this will mean higher long-term rates in Europe and in Italy. And so, of course, the debt sustainability issue comes back as an issue. And that's where I mentioned we lost a few years because we have not yet put the debt on a falling side. So this means a higher primary surplus. So it means looking forward a tighter fiscal policy.
Very good. So
we'll see whether the government is ready to implement it. Of course, 1 year before elections.
That's a big question. Yeah, that actually brings me to the one last topic I wanted to touch, which is something that you also mentioned in some of your writings, which is this idea that, I'll put it this way, like reforms are easier to pass politically at the times where they're more costly from an economic point of view. Right? There are reforms that are desirable, they're very hard to sell politically, and the only moment where we do them is actually when they're very painful. And that's a bit of it's a dilemma for democracy in a sense. And is there any improvement in institutional design, either at the European level or even in terms of national institutions? What can we do to improve that, so that in a sense we can commit to do reforms at the right time instead of having to do them in a hurry when the times are tough?
Well, this famous dilemma that was first mentioned more famously by Juncker is that he said, we politicians know how to do reforms, we don't know how to get reelected after having done reforms. But what has changed more recently is that if you don't do reforms, you are not reelected. So, and we've seen this in Europe, it's very difficult for government to get reelected. So what can you do? Well, political theory will tell you you have to do the reforms early enough in your in your mandate that you can try and hope to get some benefits before the next election come. And that's where, you know, institutional reform is so important for Italy in particular, to have more stability, longer governments. Because if you think about the next election all the time, you will never do the kind of reform because you're always afraid to hurt the lobbies that's going to suffer from the reform. So that's why I think Italy needs some institutional reform. And, you know, I think there is we will know in a few days whether this one will pass or not. But I think if we go back to governments that last 1 year, I think it's going to be very difficult for Italy to have the strength, the political strength to reform.
Very good. I promise that I will leave you some time at the end of the interview to instead talk about experience of students coming to the US and
Okay.
what it means. So why don't you?
We are close to the end. No, I just wanted to thank the organizer because coming back to Chicago is not so easy. But we discussed this morning. I wanted to mention something because this morning we discussed a lot about talent, about what it means to go to leave your country, and that's not easy. And there is one thing I wanted to mention, that you are here because of your talent. And but something I discovered in my life is that being Italian helps in some cases. For one reason is, at least in my experience, is that when I tell in, you know, either job interviews or, you know, professional experience and meetings that I'm Italian and from Florence, but, you know, it would apply for me, is that I mean, people immediately react in a positive way because they have a memory of something nice happening to them. And I realized that in fact, aside from talent that it depends on us, we have something additional. And this we should remind in the sense that, you know, in this country there's a big issue about giving back. And I think that it's important that we remind ourselves to be Italian to give back to our country. That's what I wanted to say in concluding this. That, you know, if you can think about in your life, in your professional experience, to be able to give back to your country in some ways, you know, not professionally or, you know, culturally, socially. I had an experience myself. I decided to invest part of my time in a cultural foundation in Florence, and because I think it's something that, you know, when you live and the fantastic experience of working working but studying abroad, being talented, being able to give back to your country which gave you birth. I think it's very important. So something I learned from, you know, from my professional experience, and I encourage you to pursue this. You know, the fact that you're abroad, I think, you know, we should not think too much about going back to your country. You know, it's not only, I think, professional experience is in the world today. I think we in Italy have a challenge of attracting foreigners, not only Italians back. But for us who live outside, because I live also outside, thinking about giving back something to Italy, I think it's important. So, you know, just keep this into your mind. Don't think only about your talent. Think only about your origin and what it has given to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So now it is our